the right to vote, it feels like such a basic part of any democracy, doesn't it? It's how we, the people, get to have our say. But here's the thing. For most of history, the simple question of who actually gets that right has been a huge, huge battleground. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today.
So, to really get our heads around this whole debate, we've got to start with the group of people at the very center of it all, the ones who hold all the cards, so to speak. We're talking about the electorate. I mean, in any democracy, the electorate holds just an incredible amount of power. Think about it. They're not just picking a few leaders here and there. Nope. They are shaping the actual laws we all have to live by. So, in a very real way, they are the ultimate source of all political power.
And that brings us right back to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? Who gets to be in that group? Who decides who gets to decide? Is voting a fundamental right that absolutely everyone should have? Or is it more like a privilege that you have to earn? Throughout history, people have answered that question in two completely different ways.
And this whole debate really boils down to two big competing ideas: universal suffrage and restricted suffrage. And let me tell you, they represent two totally different ways of looking at who is and who isn't qualified to take part in a democracy.
Okay, so what's the actual difference? Well, it's pretty simple. Universal franchise, you'll also hear it called suffrage, is the idea that, hey, all adult citizens should get to vote. Period. No discrimination based on how much money you have, your gender, your education, none of that. But then you've got restricted franchise, which does the exact opposite. It's designed specifically to exclude certain groups based on those very same things. All right, so let's dig into the first side of this. Let's look at the arguments for opening the voting booth to literally everyone. Why do so many people today believe that universal suffrage is the only way to go for a modern democracy? Well, the people who support it usually bring up four main points, and they're all about some really big ideas. Things like justice, equality, protecting your own interests, and, believe it or not, even education. Let's tackle the first one, and honestly, it might just be the most powerful argument of them all, because it's really just a simple appeal to what's fair. The logic here is so clear, it's almost beautiful. It goes like this. If the government expects you to pay your taxes, right, and it expects you to follow all the laws, then isn't it just fundamentally unfair to say you get no say in how that tax money is spent or how those laws get made in the first place? Okay, moving on to argument number two. This one goes right to the heart of what we even mean when we say the word democracy. The thinking is, if your entire system of government is built on the idea that all citizens are equal, well, the voting booth is where that idea really comes to life. It's where it becomes real. So the second you start creating different classes of citizens, people who can vote and people who can't, you're basically taking a sledgehammer to the very foundation of the whole democratic experience. All right, the third argument is a lot more down to earth. It's super practical. It's all about power. And when you get right down to it, it's about being able to protect yourself and your community. And this quote just nails it. The political thinker Harold Lasky put it perfectly. He said that if you strip a group of people of their political power, their right to vote, you're basically stripping them of the benefits of that power too. I mean, it makes sense, right? Lawmakers are way, way less likely to pay attention to the needs of a community if that community can't actually vote them out of a job. But here's the kicker. For a huge chunk of history, those arguments we just talked about, they didn't win. So now let's flip the coin and look at the other side, the arguments for limiting who gets a say. It's kind of wild to think about, but historically, putting limits on voting was totally normal. It was the rule, not the exception. The right to vote was often tied to whether you owned property or whether you were a man or if you had the right kind of citizenship. And even today, we have universal restrictions based on age, right? The reasons people gave for these limits usually fell into three main buckets. So first, you had this idea of proxy representation. Basically, the thought that one person, almost always the man at the house, could just vote for his whole family. Then you had arguments about responsibility and, of course, about literacy. So let's start with that first one. This idea that voting isn't just a right, it's a responsibility. The logic here went something like this. People who owned property, people who paid a lot of taxes, they had a real financial stake in the game. They had skin in the game, so to speak. And the argument was that this made them more careful, more responsible voters. It was a stark contrast to people who didn't own property, who were often seen as having nothing to lose, and therefore being, less reliable. All right, next up is an argument that's, let's just say, a lot more controversial. It's the idea that to vote, you need to have a certain level of competence. This was a really common reason given for restricting the vote. The claim was that voters who couldn't read just weren't able to do their homework on candidates or get a grip on complex political issues, and that supposedly made them easy targets for manipulation. Now, in some places, this argument was even used to create things like literacy tests, which, as many critics have pointed out, were often just a tool to keep specific groups of people from voting at all.
So, where does all this leave us today? We've got these two really powerful, totally competing ideas about who should get a voice in their own government. Well, for the most part, the modern world has really embraced universal suffrage. It's become the standard. But there's still a bit of a tension there. Some still argue that you have to look at a society's specific situation, its economy, its culture, when you're designing how its voting system works. It's kind of an acknowledgement that the road to full democracy isn't always a simple, straight line.
And all this leads us to one last, pretty challenging question I want to leave you with. We've walked through the historical arguments for and against putting limits on the vote. So today, as we all continue to shape what our democracies look like, we have to ask ourselves, if we believe that voting is a fundamental right, are there any circumstances where it's okay, where it's justifiable to take that right away from someone?